This is Misti Green, and you're listening to the I Lead Misty Blue podcast, where strategy meets soul and faith finds its voice. Have you ever taken a moment to consider the design of the ark? Not from the perspective of the flood or the animals or even the rain, but from the perspective of how intentionally it was constructed and what that construction reveals about the nature of obedience and of trust. When you read Genesis 6 carefully, what stands out is the level of specificity in what God asked Noah to build. Literally, every dimension, every material, every structural detail was revealed to Noah with precision, from the length to the width to the height, from the type of wood to the pitch that would seal it, and how every single internal compartment would serve a specific purpose. Nothing about the ark was left to assumption, and nothing about its construction was vague. And yet within all of that detail, there's something that was not included. And it's something that becomes more significant the longer you really think about the ark. There was no mention of a mechanism for Noah to control where the ark would go once the waters rose. There was no rudder to guide direction. There were no sails to catch momentum. And there was no structure that allowed him to determine timing or even destination. What this story revealed to me is that the ark was not designed for navigation. The ark was designed for preservation. That distinction becomes important because it reframes the entire way that the assignment was given to Noah. When Genesis 6:22 tells us that Noah did everything just as God commanded him, it is not simply affirming Noah's obedience in building the ark. It's revealing that his role was never to understand. It was never to manage what would happen next. See, Noah's role was to follow the instructions he had been given and to trust that what God asked him to build would be sufficient for whatever was coming. By the time we reach Genesis 7, the nature of that trust becomes even clearer. God doesn't tell Noah to prepare to steer the ark or to determine its course. Instead, he instructs Noah to simply enter it. Go into the ark, you and your whole family, he says. And in that moment, Noah's responsibility shifts from constructing something he could control to actually entering something he could not. That movement from building the ark to entering the ark carries deeper meaning. It's representing the transition from action to complete and total surrender. See, while Noah was building, he was actively engaged in the process, following detailed instructions and using his hands to bring something into existence. Once he entered the ark, however, his role changed. He was no longer responsible for what was to happen to the structure. He was responsible for trusting the one who gave the vision for the structure and relying on the one who outlined every instruction for building it. But there came a point when Noah's charge was simple. His charge was to remain within the structure. And that is where this becomes difficult for us to fully embrace, at least for me, because we are far more comfortable with the part of obedience that allows us to do something than we are with the part that requires us to trust without control. See, we often associate movement or momentum with progress, and we seem to associate clarity with readiness, which leads us to seek understanding before we're willing to commit. Noah didn't have that option. He didn't know how long the rain would fall. He didn't know how long the waters would rise, or even where the ark would ultimately rest. Noah didn't have a map or even a timeline. He didn't have a guarantee of what the outcome would look like once everything had passed. What he had was instruction, and what he demonstrated was trust. Hebrews 11:17 reflects on this moment by describing Noah as someone who built the ark in response to what he had not yet seen. This phrase carries weight because it removes evidence from the equation. There was no visible confirmation that what God said would happen was about to occur. There was no external validation that his obedience would even lead to safety. It was blind trust. What existed was a word from God and a decision for Noah to act on that word or on that promise. As the story continues and the rain begins, Genesis 7:17 tells us that waters increased and lifted the ark high above the earth. That detail right there, the ark lifted high above the earth. See, it's easy to read past that, but it's worth processing because it reveals something that reshapes how we understand difficult seasons. The same waters that were destroying everything else were lifting the ark. What carried destruction for some carried preservation for what God had called and covered. See, the storm didn't press the ark. It preserved it. It carried it. That realization offers a different perspective, especially for those who find themselves in seasons that feel uncertain or even overwhelming. There's often an instinct to escape what feels unstable, to regain control where control has been lost, and to move away from anything that introduces discomfort. And yet there are moments when what feels like instability is actually movement, and what feels like loss of control is actually divine direction. Psalms 29:10 reminds us that the Lord sits enthroned over the flood. What does that mean? It means that even in the midst of what feels chaotic, His presence remains steady and doesn't lose its footing. If God reigns over the flood, then the flood itself isn't outside of God's authority. And if it's not outside of God's authority, then the experience of being carried by it is not evidence that something has gone wrong. Maybe it's evidence that something is being directed in a way that doesn't require your control. This challenges the way we often interpret responsibility because control can feel like a form of security. It can give the impression that we are actively participating in the outcome, that we're managing what needs to be managed, and that we're ensuring a particular direction. However, there are times when control is less about responsibility and more about trusting the discomfort with uncertainty. Faith, on the other hand, requires a completely different posture. It requires the willingness to remain in what God has established without trying to alter its direction. And for many of us, that is hard. Genesis 8:1 tells us that God remembered Noah. I love when scripture says God remembered. God remembered Noah. And while that language may sound as though God had forgotten and then recalled Noah, it's actually pointing to a shift in the season. It's a moment where what was necessary for a time begins to move toward what comes next. Noah didn't leave the ark based on his own sense of readiness. He didn't decide that enough time had passed or that the conditions were right for him to exit. He remained within the structure until God spoke again. That kind of waiting is not passive. It is intentional trust. It's the discipline of remaining where you have been placed until direction is given, even when you would prefer to move forward or to move out of where you currently are. There are people who find themselves in seasons where they feel suspended. We've talked about that before, where progress isn't really visible in the way that they would expect, and when control feels just out of reach. And there's a level of discomfort that settles. In those moments, it's easy to interpret that experience as a delay or stagnation in your process. However, the ark was not designed to accelerate Noah's timeline. It was designed to preserve his life and his lineage. Sometimes the purpose of a season isn't advancement, it's preservation. Isaiah 43:2 reminds us that when we pass through the waters, God is with us. And that promise doesn't remove the presence of the water. It reframes it. It shifts the focus from what is happening around us to who is present with us. The ark had no steering mechanism because Noah was never meant to direct its course. He was only meant to trust the one who held and controlled the waters. And that same principle applies now, because there are moments where knowing where you are going is not what establishes your safety. It's in trusting who is guiding your course. There's a kind of rest that comes when you release the need. You release the need to control what was never yours to carry or direct. And there's a steadiness that will begin to develop when you recognize that direction doesn't depend on your ability to manage every single outcome. The absence of control in a season doesn't mean that you're lost. It simply means that you're being carried. This is Misti Green, and you have been listening to the I Lead Misty Blue podcast. Until next time, trust His timing. Trust His direction. He knows all of the unknown. And remember, sometimes the purpose of a season isn't advancement, it's preservation.